In the shadowed halls of Enderby Hall, a scream shatters the morning calm. A trusted butler lies dead, a shattered vase beside him, and secrets bloom like thorns among the Manor's elite. Who wielded the fatal blow? Was it the indebted heir, the cunning actress, or the silent companion hiding a dangerous truth? As whispers of blackmail and betrayal surface, only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and little gray cells, can unravel the deadly puzzle. Will she expose the killer before the roses of Enderby Hall wilt under the weight of lies? Dive into a mystery where every clue counts, and no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The Quiet of Enderby Hall. In the drowsy haze of an English summer, Enderby Hall stood as a monument to faded grandeur, its ivy-clad walls basking in the late August sun of 1932. Nestled in the heart of St. Mary Mead, the manor was a relic of Victorian opulence, its tall windows glinting like watchful eyes over the village green. The air was thick with the scent of roses and the hum of bees, but beneath the idyllic calm, a subtle tension simmered, as if the house itself held its breath. The Enderby family, once lords of commerce and industry, had dwindled to a handful of heirs and hangers-on, each tethered to the estate by necessity or nostalgia. The patriarch, Sir Reginald Enderby, had passed some years ago, leaving his widow, Lady Margaret, to preside over the household with a brittle dignity. Her son, Charles, a man of 40, with a penchant for fast cars and faster debts, was the nominal heir. His wife, Evelyn, a former actress with a sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, filled the halls with her restless energy. Then there was Beatrice, Sir Reginald's niece, a quiet young woman whose devotion to her garden belied a keen intelligence. Rounding out the inner circle was Dr. Harold Vance, the family physician, whose frequent visits seemed as much social as medical, and Clara Weston, Lady Margaret's companion, a woman whose meekness masked a watchful nature. On this particular morning, the household was abuzz with preparations for the annual Enderby garden party, a tradition that drew the village elite to the manor's sprawling lawns. The servants bustled about, polishing silver and arranging flowers, while Lady Margaret surveyed the scene from the drawing room, her hands clasped tightly over her cane. "Everything must be perfect," she declared to Clara, her voice as crisp as the starched linens. "The Enderby name depends on it." Clara nodded, her eyes darting to the window where Charles lounged on the terrace, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Of course, ma'am," she murmured, though her tone carried a faint edge, unnoticed by her mistress. Evelyn, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen, having stormed off after a heated exchange with Charles over breakfast. The servants whispered of her latest outburst, something about a missing necklace, though no one dared repeat the act. Among the rosebeds, paused to wipe her brow, her eyes catching a glint of something metallic, half buried in the soil. She frowned, brushing away the dirt to reveal a small, ornate key, its filigree design tarnished but intact.
"Curious,"
she murmured, slipping it into her pocket. She glanced toward the house, where Dr. Vance was descending the steps, his medical bag in hand. "Good morning, Beatrice," he called, his smile warm but fleeting. "Keeping the roses in order, I see." "As always," she replied, her gaze lingering on him. There was something in his manner, a nervous twitch of the fingers, perhaps, that set her on edge. But before she could ponder further, a scream pierced the air, sharp and unmistakable, from the direction of the conservatory. The household froze. Lady Margaret's cane clattered to the floor. Charles stubbed out his cigarette and bolted towards the sound, Dr. Vance close behind. Beatrice, clutching the key, followed at a slower pace, her heart pounding. Clara, pale as the linen she carried, stood rooted in the doorway, her eyes wide with something more complex than fear. In the conservatory, they found Evelyn, her face ashen, standing over a crumpled figure on the tiled floor. It was Thomas Reed, the estate's longtime butler, his lifeless eyes staring at the glass ceiling. A thin trickle of blood seeped from a wound at his temple, and beside him lay a shattered porcelain vase, its fragments scattered like petals. "Good heavens!" Lady Margaret gasped, clutching Clara's arm. "What has happened here?" Charles knelt beside the body, his hands trembling. He's dead," he stammered, looking to Dr. Vance for confirmation. The doctor, his face grim, nodded after a brief examination. "A blow to the head," he said quietly. "Not an accident, I'm afraid." Evelyn's voice broke the silence, shrill and accusing. "Who would do this? Thomas was harmless. She stopped, her eyes darting to the others, as if searching for a culprit among them. Lady Margaret straightened, her composure returning like a shield. "We must send for the police," she said firmly. "And perhaps someone else. Someone who can make sense of this madness." Beatrice, still clutching the key, met Clara's gaze across the room. For a moment their eyes locked, and in that fleeting exchange a silent question passed between them. "What do you know?" As the household dispersed to await the authorities, the roses outside swayed gently in the breeze, their beauty untouched by the shadow that had fallen over Enderby Hall. And in the village of St. Mary Mead, word was already spreading that Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming Thomas Reed's body remained where it had fallen. The shattered vase, a silent witness to the violence that had ended his life. The local police, led by the earnest but overworked Inspector Grayson, had arrived promptly, cordoning off the scene with a diligence that bordered on theatrical. Servants hovered at the edges, their whispers like the rustle of leaves, while the family gathered in the drawing room, their faces a study in shock, grief, and Miss Jane Marple noted, as she entered, guarded unease. Miss Marple, a slight figure in a tweed skirt and lavender cardigan, stepped into the manor with the quiet assurance of one accustomed to being underestimated. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, swept the room, taking in the polished mahogany, the heavy drapes, and the strained expressions of the Enderby household. Captain Hastings, her occasional companion, trailed behind, his military bearing softened by a touch of bewilderment at the scene before them. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he murmured, adjusting his hat. "Poor fellow didn't deserve this." "Few do, Hastings," Miss Marple replied, her voice low but clear, like a bell in fog. "But it is not the deserving we must consider, it is the truth." She declined a seat, choosing instead to stand by the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the room. Inspector Grayson, a man whose moustache seemed to carry the weight of his authority, cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, I'm told you have a knack for these matters. We've a murder on our hands, no doubt about it. Blunt force trauma, says Dr. Vance. The vase was the weapon, but we've no fingerprints yet. Too many shards, too much mess." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the family. Lady Margaret sat rigidly, her hands folded over her cane, her lips a thin line of disapproval. Charles paced by the window, his cigarette case clicking open and shut with nervous rhythm. Evelyn, draped in a silk shawl, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though Miss Marple noted the absence of tears. Beatrice, still in her gardening gloves, sat quietly, her fingers absently tracing the outline of the key in her pocket. Clara Weston, ever the shadow, hovered near Lady Margaret, her gaze flickering between the others like a moth uncertain of its flame. Dr. Vance, standing apart, adjusted his spectacles, his calm demeanour betrayed by the slight tremor in his hands. "Perhaps, Inspector," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but probing, "you might share what you know of the morning's events, a timeline if you please." Grayson consulted his notebook. "Right. Thomas Reed was found at approximately 10:30 this morning by Mrs. Evelyn Enderby. Dr. Vance estimates death occurred between 9 and 10. The household was preparing for the garden party, so everyone claims to have been busy. Lady Margaret was in the drawing room with Miss Weston from 9 onwards, smoking, alone. Miss Beatrice was in the rose garden, also alone. Mrs. Evelyn says she was in her room until she went to the conservatory to check the flower arrangements. Dr. Vance arrived at 9:15 for his daily visit to Lady Margaret and was in the library until the scream. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. And the servants? Most were in the kitchens or setting up tables outside, Grayson replied. The headmaid, Mrs. Porter, says Thomas was last seen alive at 9, fetching a tray from the kitchen. No one saw him enter the conservatory. A curious detail, Miss Marple mused. The conservatory is not a place one wanders into by chance. It is a destination. She turned to Evelyn, her gaze softening but no less piercing. Mrs. Enderby, you found poor Mr. Reed. Might you describe what drew you to the conservatory? Evelyn stiffened, her handkerchief twisting in her hands. I was checking the flowers, as I said. The orchids needed attention before the party. I walked in, and there he was, lying there, with that awful vase broken beside him. Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple noted the careful cadence, as if rehearsed. And you saw no one else? Miss Marple pressed. No one, Evelyn said quickly, her eyes darting to Charles, who stopped pacing and stared back. Miss Marple smiled faintly, resuming her knitting. Most interesting. Inspector, might we see the conservatory? The group moved to the scene of the crime, where the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and broken blooms. Thomas Reed's body had been covered with a sheet, but the vase's fragments remained, scattered across the tiles. Miss Marple knelt, her movements deliberate, and examined a shard. Porcelain, she murmured, quite heavy, not easily toppled. Hastings, peering over her shoulder, frowned. Looks like it was struck with some force, Miss Marple. A deliberate blow, you think? Perhaps, she replied, her eyes scanning the floor. She paused at a faint scuff mark near the body, barely visible against the tiles. Or perhaps not. Standing, she turned to Beatrice, who lingered at the edge of the group. Miss Enderby, you were in the garden this morning. Did you hear anything unusual? A crash, perhaps? Beatrice hesitated, her hand tightening around the key in her pocket. No, nothing like that. Just the usual sounds. Birds, the wind. I was focused on the roses. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Of course, the roses are lovely this year. As the group returned to the drawing room, Charles's restless pacing, Clara's watchful silence, Dr. Vance's trembling hands, each was a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of Enderby Hall, the truth lay hidden, waiting for her little grey cells to uncover it. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Order. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawns of Enderby Hall, where the preparations for the garden party had come to an abrupt halt. The village police, under Inspector Grayson's direction, had sealed the conservatory and stationed a constable at the manor's entrance, turning away curious villagers who lingered at the gates. Inside, the atmosphere was one of strained civility, as if the household clung to decorum to keep the spectre of murder at bay. Miss Jane Marple, however, was undeterred by the tension, her calm presence a stark contrast to the agitation around her. She sat in the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy oak furniture, her knitting bag at her side. Captain Hastings stood by the window, watching the constables outside, while Inspector Grayson flipped through his notebook with a furrowed brow. "Miss Marple," Grayson began, "I've sent for the coroner, but it'll be hours before he arrives. In the meantime, I'd value your thoughts. You've a reputation for seeing what others miss." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained demure. "You are kind, Inspector, but I merely observe what is already there. People, you see, are not so different from my village neighbors. They wear their secrets like ill-fitting coats, always a thread out of place." She paused, her needles clicking rhythmically. "Shall we begin with the household? I should like to speak with each in turn." Grayson nodded, summoning Clara Weston first. The companion entered, her hands clasped tightly, her plain grey dress blending into the room's sombre tones. Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in Clara's fingers, the way her eyes darted to the door as if expecting an interruption. "Miss Weston," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but precise. "You were with Lady Margaret this morning, I understand, from 9 o'clock onward. Did you leave her side at all?" Clara's lips tightened. "No, Miss Marple. I was in the drawing-room arranging her correspondence. Lady Margaret is particular about her letters. And you heard nothing unusual? No raised voices, no crash of porcelain?" "Nothing," Clara said, though her gaze flickered to the floor. "It was a quiet morning until the scream." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Miss Weston. That will be all for now." As Clara retreated, Miss Marple turned to Hastings. "A nervous disposition, perhaps, but there is something
Nonchalance, a thin veneer over his unease.
"Look here, Miss Marple," he said. "I don't know what you expect to find. I was on the terrace all morning. Didn't see a soul until Evelyn screamed." Miss Marple's needles paused. "The terrace overlooks the rose garden, does it not? You must have seen Miss Beatrice at her work." Charles blinked, caught off guard. "Well, yes, I suppose I did. She was pottering about with her roses, as usual. Didn't think much of it." "And Mr. Reed? Did you see him pass by, perhaps on his way to the conservatory?" "No," Charles said quickly. Too quickly. "I mean, I wasn't paying attention. Servants come and go." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course. Thank you, Mr. Enderby." Evelyn Enderby entered next, her silk dress rustling with every step. She perched on the edge of a chair, her eyes still red-rimmed but dry. "This is dreadful," she said, her voice low and theatrical. "Thomas was such a loyal servant. Who could do such a thing?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "You mentioned checking the orchids in the conservatory. Was that a regular task of yours?" Evelyn hesitated, her fingers twisting her handkerchief. "Not regular, no. But with the garden party I thought... But I wanted everything perfect." "And you saw no one else in the conservatory? No sign of a struggle?" "None," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "Just Thomas, lying there?" Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Evelyn's hands, noting the absence of her usual rings. "Thank you, Mrs. Enderby. You've been most helpful." Beatrice followed, her gardening gloves now tucked into her pocket, the key still a secret weight against her side. She sat with a quiet dignity, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's without flinching. "Miss Enderby," Miss Marple said, "you were in the rose garden all morning. It is a lovely spot,
quite close to the conservatory. Did you notice anyone approaching it?" Beatrice's fingers twitched, but her voice was steady. "No one, Miss Marple. I was focused on my work. The roses needed pruning and I lose track of time out there." Miss Marple smiled. "A gardener's passion is a fine thing. And yet, you found something this morning, did you not? A small object, perhaps, in the soil?" Beatrice's breath caught, her hand instinctively moving to her pocket. Yes, a key. I meant to mention it to the inspector, but with everything— No matter," Miss Marple said kindly. "Might I see it?" Demeanor now tinged with fatigue. "I was in the library, reviewing Lady Margaret's charts," he said. "I heard nothing until the scream. Thomas was a good man, reliable, discreet. I can't imagine why anyone would harm him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "You knew him well, Doctor?" "As well as one knows a servant," Vance replied, adjusting his spectacles. "He was always about, managing the household." As Vance left, Miss Marple turned to Hastings and Grayson, her knitting needles still. "A key, a scuff mark, a broken vase, and a household full of secrets," she said softly. "Each tells a story, but not yet the whole one." Hastings frowned. "You think they're lying, Miss Marple?" "Not lying, perhaps," she replied, her eyes distant, "but holding back. Each has a piece of the puzzle, and I suspect poor Mr. Reed knew something that made him dangerous. We must look closer at the little things, Hastings. The little things always matter." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Enderby Hall in twilight. And in the quiet library, Miss Marple's mind began to weave the threads of suspicion into a pattern only she could see. Chapter 4. The Threads of Inquiry. The library at Enderby Hall, with its high ceilings and musty tomes, seemed to absorb the weight of the day's events, its silence broken only by the soft ticking of a grandfather clock. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her thoughts. Captain Hastings stood by the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back, while Inspector Grayson paced, his notebook now bristling with hastily scribbled notes. The interviews had yielded fragments of truth, but the puzzle of Thomas Reed's murder remained tantalizingly incomplete. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unyielding, scanned the room as she spoke. "Inspector, might we examine Mr. Reed's belongings? A butler, you see, is the heart of a household. He sees all, hears all, and often knows more than he tells." Grayson nodded, gesturing to a constable who brought in a small wooden box, its contents meticulously catalogued. "This was found in Reed's room," Grayson said. "Not much. A few letters, a pocket watch, a notebook with household accounts. Nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple opened the box, her fingers delicate but purposeful. The letters were mundane, mostly from a sister in Devon, filled with family news. The pocket watch was worn, but functional. Its hands stopped at 9:47, a detail that made her pause. Reed was observant, perhaps too observant. "Inspector, have you searched the study?" "Not yet," Grayson admitted. "We've been focused on the conservatory, but I'll have my men look into it." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "If I may, I should like to see it myself, and perhaps, Captain Hastings, you might accompany me?" Hastings brightened, eager for action. "Of course, Miss Marple, lead the way." The study was a smaller room off the main hall, its walls lined with portraits of stern Enderby ancestors. A heavy oak desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a locked drawer. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the lock, its design strikingly similar to the filigree key Beatrice had found. "Captain Hastings," she said softly, "might you fetch Miss Beatrice? I believe she has something that belongs here." While Hastings hurried off, Miss Marple examined the room. A faint scent of tobacco lingered, though none of the family admitted to smoking in the study. A single chair was slightly askew, its cushion bearing the faint imprint of someone who had sat there recently. On the floor near the desk, she spotted a tiny thread of blue silk, almost invisible against the rug. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her expression thoughtful. Beatrice arrived, the key clutched in her hand. "You think it fits the desk?" she asked, her voice low. "Let us see," Miss Marple replied. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the drawer opened to reveal a small ledger, its pages filled with transactions, large sums marked with initials C-E-E-E-H-V. Beside them were dates, the most recent being the previous evening. "Good heavens," Hastings said, peering over her shoulder. "This looks like a record of payments. Blackmail, perhaps?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Or debts, or secrets. We must not jump to conclusions, Hastings, but this ledger is a thread we must follow." She closed the drawer, locking it again, and handed the key back to Beatrice. "Keep this safe, my dear. It may yet unlock more than a drawer." Returning to the library, Miss Marple addressed Grayson. "Inspector, I suggest you question the household about their movements last night. Mr. Reed's notes mention a midnight meeting in this very study. Who was here and why?" Grayson scribbled a note, his face grim. "I'll get to it. But Miss Marple, you're suggesting Reed knew something worth killing for?" "Precisely," she replied. "A butler is invisible."
Marple paused by the conservatory's entrance, noting a faint smudge of dirt on the threshold, as if someone had stepped in from the garden. She glanced at the rose garden, where Beatrice had been working, and then at the terrace where Charles claimed to have been. "The geometry of this house," she said softly, "is as much a clue as the people within it." Hastings frowned. "Geometry, Miss Marple? You mean the layout?" "Exactly," she said, her needles resuming their quiet dance. "Who could see whom and when? Who could move unseen and where? These are the questions that will lead us to the truth." As they returned to the manor, the clock struck 4, its chimes echoing through the halls. Miss Marple's mind, however, was already tracing the paths of Enderby Hall, piecing together the movements of its inhabitants like a map of motives and opportunities. Somewhere, in the tangle of alibis and secrets, lay the key to Thomas Reed's murder, and she was determined to find it. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The twilight cast a soft violet glow over Enderby Hall, softening the edges of its stern architecture, but doing little to ease the tension within. The household had retreated to their respective corners, each nursing private fears or secrets, while the police continued their methodical search of the grounds. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the gathering dusk, sat in the drawing-room with Captain Hastings, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome as she reviewed the day's discoveries. Inspector Grayson, looking more harried by the hour, had just returned from questioning the servants, his notebook now a chaotic jumble of contradictions. "Miss Marple," Grayson said, rubbing his temples, "I'm beginning to think this case is a mare's nest. The servants swear Thomas Reed was in the kitchen at 9, but no one can confirm where he went after. And the family's alibis are as solid as a house of cards. Charles Enderby's story about smoking on the terrace doesn't hold up. Mrs. Porter, the head maid, says she saw him near the conservatory around 9:15, arguing with someone." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Arguing, you say? With whom?" "She couldn't tell," Grayson admitted. "It was too far and the morning mist was thick. But she's certain it was Charles. His red scarf was unmistakable." "A red scarf," Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing. "Most interesting. And what of the midnight meeting Mr. Reed noted in his book? Have you questioned the household about their whereabouts last night?" Grayson nodded. "I've pressed them, but they're cagey. Lady Margaret claims she was in bed by 10, with Clara attending her. Charles says he was in his room, alone. Evelyn insists she was reading in the parlour until 11, then retired. Beatrice was in a greenhouse."
The village.
Miss Marple's lips pursed. "And yet, Mr. Reed's note mentions E&V midnight study. One assumes Evelyn Enderby and Dr. Harold Vance. But why meet in secret? And why did Mr. Reed find it worth noting?" Hastings, leaning forward, ventured a guess. "Sounds like an affair, Miss Marple. Evelyn's a bit of a flirt, and Vance is always hovering about. Perhaps Reed caught them and threatened to tell Charles." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "A possibility, Hastings, but we must not leap to conclusions. An affair is a convenient motive, but convenience can be a trap. Let us consider the ledger we found in the study. Those payments, large sums marked with initials. If Mr. Reed was privy to financial dealings, he may have stumbled upon something far more dangerous than a dalliance." Grayson frowned. "You think he was blackmailing someone? That'd explain the murder, but not who did it. Everyone in this house seems to have a motive. Charles is drowning in gambling debts. Mrs. Porter let that slip. Evelyn's been selling off jewelry to fund her lifestyle, according to the cook. Beatrice stands to inherit a tidy sum if Charles is disinherited, and Lady Margaret's been fretting about the family's finances. Even Dr. Vance isn't clean. There's talk in the village about his investments going sour." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. "A circle of suspects, each with their own burdens. And yet, the answer lies not in their motives alone, but in the details they overlook. Inspector, might we revisit the conservatory? There is something about that scuff mark that troubles me." The trio made their way to the conservatory, where the air was still heavy with the scent of earth and broken blooms. The police had cleared away the body, but the shattered vase remained, its fragments carefully collected in a box. Miss Marple knelt by the spot where Thomas Reed had fallen, her fingers tracing the faint scuff mark on the tiles. "This mark," she said softly, "is not from a shoe. It is too narrow, too precise. A cane, perhaps, or the edge of a tool." Hastings crouched beside her, squinting. "A cane? You mean Lady Margaret's? But she was in the drawing room all morning." "Was she?" Miss Marple replied, her voice mild but pointed. "Or was she near enough to be seen, yet not so near as to be questioned? Alibis, Hastings, are only as strong as the eyes that confirm them." Grayson, intrigued, jotted down a note. "You're suggesting Lady Margaret could be involved? She's frail, Miss Marple, hardly capable of swinging a vase." "Strength is not always physical,"
Miss Marple said, rising, "and motives are not always obvious. Let us consider." Shifted to the family, who had gathered for tea, their politeness a brittle facade. Charles, his red scarf now conspicuously absent, avoided her gaze. Evelyn sipped her tea with exaggerated calm, her fingers bare of rings. Beatrice sat quietly, her eyes flickering to the window, while Clara hovered near Lady Margaret, her expression unreadable. Dr. Vance, summoned back to the manor, stood by the door, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight. Miss Marple addressed them all, her voice deceptively gentle. "I wonder," she said, "if anyone might recall an argument near the conservatory this morning. A small matter, perhaps, but every detail helps." The room fell silent, the clink of teacups stilled. Charles coughed, his face flushing. "I told you, I was on the terrace. No arguments." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You were hardly on the terrace all morning, Charles. I saw you wandering about, looking cross." "Enough, Evelyn," Lady Margaret snapped, her cane tapping the floor. "This is not the time for your theatrics." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her eyes missed nothing. The flush on Charles's face, the tightening of Evelyn's lips, the faint tremor in Clara's hands. "Thank you," she said. "You have all been most illuminating." As the family dispersed, Hastings whispered, "They're pointing fingers at each other, Miss Marple. Charles seems the obvious culprit now, with that scarf business." "Obvious," Miss Marple replied, "is often misleading. The scarf is a distraction, Hastings. The truth lies elsewhere, in the study, in the ledger, in the key. We must look beyond the noise to the silence beneath." Outside, the stars began to emerge, their cold light falling on Enderby Hall. And in the drawing room, Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm, each stitch a step closer to unraveling the tangled web of deceit. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The morning light filtered through the heavy drapes of Enderby Hall, casting a muted glow over the drawing room, where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting a steady counterpoint to the restless energy of the household. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and the family's attempts at normalcy, breakfast served, newspapers unfolded, felt like a poorly rehearsed play. Captain Hastings, ever loyal, stood by the window, his eyes scanning the grounds as if the roses themselves might confess. Inspector Grayson, meanwhile, was poring over a report from the coroner, his brow furrowed in frustration. "Miss Marple," Grayson said, "set aside. The absence of evidence is itself a clue. A careful murderer, or perhaps one who acted in haste and covered their tracks well." She turned to Hastings. "Captain, might you fetch the box of vase fragments? I should like to examine them more closely." Hastings returned with the box, and Miss Marple sifted through the shards, her fingers delicate but purposeful. One piece, larger than the rest, bore a faint smear of red, not blood, but something waxy like lipstick or polish. "Curious," she murmured, holding it to the light. "This was no ordinary accident. The vase was struck with precision, yet this mark suggests a moment of carelessness." Grayson leaned in. "Lipstick? Could point to Mrs. Enderby. She's always painted up like a stage actress." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. "But let us not assume. This mark could belong to anyone,
or anything. A servant polishing furniture, a guest brushing against the vase. We must consider all possibilities. Her attention shifted to the household, who had gathered reluctantly at Grayson's request. Lady Margaret sat ramrod straight, a cane resting against her chair. Charles, his red scarf now replaced by a green one, fidgeted with his cigarette case. Evelyn, her lips freshly rouged, avoided Miss Marple's gaze. Beatrice, her hands free of gardening gloves, sat quietly, her eyes on the floor. Clara Weston hovered near Lady Margaret, her fingers twisting a plain silver ring. Dr. Vance, summoned once more, stood by the door, his spectacles fogging slightly in the warm room. Miss Marple addressed them with her usual calm. "I wonder," she said, holding up the shard, "if anyone might explain this mark. It is not blood, but it is distinctive." Evelyn's hand flew to her lips, though she quickly recovered. "I've no idea," she said, a voice sharp. "I don't wear red lipstick. It's far too garish." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Evelyn's lips, noting the coral shade. "Of course," she said mildly. "And yet, someone in this house uses such a color. Perhaps a servant?" Clara's voice was soft but clear. "The maids don't wear makeup, Miss Marple. Lady Margaret forbids it." Lady Margaret nodded, her expression stern. "Quite right. Standards must be maintained." Miss Marple smiled faintly, tucking the shard back into the box. "Thank you. Now, let us turn to last night's meeting in the study. Mr. Reed's notebook mentioned E and V, midnight. Something he mistook for a meeting. Charles snorted, breaking the tension. Reed was always poking his nose where it didn't belong. Probably got what was coming to him. "Charles," Lady Margaret snapped, her cane tapping sharply. "That is enough." Miss Marple's gaze settled on Charles, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Enderby, you were seen near the conservatory at 9:15, despite claiming to be on the terrace. Might you explain?" Charles's cigarette case snapped shut. "Mrs. Porter's mistaken. I was on the terrace. The mist was thick. She could have seen anyone." Beatrice spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "The mist wasn't that thick, Charles. I was in the garden. I could see the terrace clearly." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, and Clara's fingers stilled on her ring. Dr. Vance cleared his throat, but said nothing. Miss Marple noted it all, her mind cataloguing each glance, each hesitation. "Inspector," she said, turning to Grayson, "might we examine the study again? I believe there is more to learn there." The group moved to the study, where the air still held a faint trace of tobacco. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the desk, where the ledger had been found. Beside it, unnoticed until now, was a single cigarette stub, its tip marked with the same red, waxy substance as the vase shard. "Most curious," she said, picking it up with her handkerchief. "This was not here yesterday." Hastings frowned. "Someone's been careless, Miss Marple. But whose cigarette is it?" "That," she replied, "is what we must discover. A cigarette, a key, a ledger, a scuff mark, these are the threads of our tapestry. And one of them, I am certain,
will lead us to the truth. As the household dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the study, her eyes tracing the room's contours. The portraits of Enderby ancestors seemed to watch her, their stern faces guarding secrets of their own. And in the quiet, her little grey cells worked tirelessly, piecing together the puzzle of Thomas Reed's death. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The atmosphere in Enderby Hall had grown taut as a violin string, each member of the household moving with the wary precision of those who know they are watched. By late morning, the police had completed their search of the servants' quarters, finding nothing but a few personal trinkets and a growing sense of frustration.
Mark on the vase shard are only new leads, but they're thin. I'm starting to think we're chasing shadows. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of quiet amusement. Shadows, Inspector, are cast by something solid. We have only to find the source. The cigarette stub, for instance. Its red mark matches the vase shard. This suggests a connection. Perhaps a moment of carelessness by our murderer. She paused, her gaze settling on the family. Let us explore another thread. The ledger from the study. Those payments, marked with initials, suggest a financial motive. Might we discuss the family's affairs? Lady Margaret stiffened, her cane tapping the floor. Our finances are private, Miss Marple. I hardly see how they relate to this tragedy. Forgive me, Lady Margaret, Miss Marple said gently. But murder is rarely unconnected to such matters. Mr. Reed's notes mentioned debts, meetings, and a missing key. If he knew of financial irregularities, it might explain why he was silenced. Charles, his face flushed, slammed a cigarette case on the table. This is absurd. Are you accusing us of killing our own butler over money? Reed was nobody, a servant. Evelyn's eyes flashed. Don't be a fool, Charles. You're hardly one to talk about money, with your gambling debts piling up. Everyone in the village knows you've been borrowing against the estate. The room fell silent, the accusation hanging like smoke. Beatrice's hands tightened in her lap, while Clara's gaze dropped to the floor. Dr. Vance cleared his throat, his voice measured. Mrs. Enderby, such talk is unhelpful. We're all upset, but airing grievances won't bring Reed back. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. On the contrary, Dr. Vance, such outbursts are most illuminating. They reveal what lies beneath the surface, resentments, fears, secrets. Let us consider the ledger's initials, C-E-E-E-H-V. One might assume Charles, Evelyn, and yourself, Doctor. Were you making payments to someone, or receiving them? Vance's spectacles glinted as he adjusted them. I've no idea what you're suggesting. I'm a physician, not a financier. If my initials are there, it's a coincidence. Evelyn laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. A coincidence? Like my necklace going missing last week, or Charles's business trips to London that always end with him broke. Enough! Lady Margaret's voice cut through the room, her cane striking the floor with force. This family will not be torn apart by idle gossip. Miss Marple, I insist you focus on the facts, not these insinuations. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Of course. Beatrice spoke at last, her voice low. I've seen Charles smoke in the study, though he knows Lady Margaret disapproves. And I once saw Thomas there, late at night, tidying up. He might have noticed something.
Charles rounded on her. "What are you implying, Beatrice? That I killed Reed because he caught me with a cigarette? That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Beatrice replied, her eyes steady. "You were near the conservatory that morning, Charles. I saw you, despite what you told the inspector." The room erupted in murmurs, Grayson scribbling furiously. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm but commanding. "Let us not accuse prematurely. Miss Beatrice, you mentioned seeing Mr. Reed in the study. Did he seem troubled?" Beatrice hesitated, her fingers brushing the pocket where the key still rested. "He was distracted. He was holding a letter, reading it quickly, then tucked it away when he saw me. I thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple's needles paused. "A letter. Most intriguing. Inspector, have you searched Mr. Reed's room thoroughly? A letter might hold the key to his knowledge and his death." Grayson nodded, dispatching a constable to double-check. As the family dispersed, their voices sharp with tension, Miss Marple turned to Hastings. "The lies are multiplying, Hastings. Charles's presence near the conservatory, Evelyn's missing necklace, Dr. Vance's evasiveness, Beatrice's key, Clara's silence. Each is a piece of the puzzle. But the letter, that may be the thread that binds them." Hastings frowned. "You think Reed was killed over a letter? What could it contain?" "Something worth killing for," Miss Marple replied, her eyes distant. "A secret, a debt, a betrayal. We must find it, and we must look closely at those who claim to know nothing." As the clock struck noon, the constable returned, holding a crumpled envelope found tucked inside Reed's mattress. It was unsealed, its contents a single sheet of paper with a brief handwritten note. "The debt must be paid by Friday, or the truth comes out. V." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "And there it is, Hastings. The shadow takes shape. But whose hand wrote this note? And what truth did Thomas Reed know?" Outside, the roses swayed in the breeze, their beauty a stark contrast to the secrets blooming within Enderby Hall. And in the library, Miss Marple's little grey cells worked rhythm. But her eyes were sharp, missing nothing as the family gathered once more at Inspector Grayson's request. Captain Hastings stood by the door, his posture stiff with anticipation, while Grayson clutched the note, its single line. "The debt must be paid by Friday, or the truth comes out. V." Burning a hole in his thoughts. "Miss Marple," Grayson began, his voice strained. "This note changes things. It points to blackmail, and with that V, it's hard not to look at Dr. Vance, but we need more than a letter to make an arrest." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze settling on the family. "Indeed, Inspector, a note is a clue, but not the whole story. Blackmail suggests a secret, and secrets are rarely kept by one person alone. Let us see what our friends here can tell us." The family sat in uneasy silence, their faces a gallery of guarded expressions. Lady Margaret gripped her cane, her knuckles white. Charles, his green scarf askew, lit another cigarette, his hands trembling. Evelyn's lips were tightly pursed, a coral lipstick a stark contrast to her pale face. Beatrice sat quietly, her fingers brushing the pocket where the filigree key rested. Clara Weston, ever the shadow, hovered near Lady Margaret, her eyes flickering with something that might have been fear.
Dr. Vance, his spectacles glinting, stood apart, his calm demeanor now fraying at the edges. Miss Marple held up the note, a voice gentle but unyielding. This was found among Mr. Reed's possessions. It speaks of a debt and a truth. Dr. Vance, the initial V might suggest you. Have you any explanation? Vance's face flushed, his voice rising. This is preposterous. I've never written such a note. I was home last night, as I told you. My housekeeper can vouch for me. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Your housekeeper, Harold? The same one who's half deaf and half blind? Convenient. Evelyn! Charles snapped, his cigarette dropping ash onto the rug. You're not exactly above suspicion with your missing necklace and your midnight wanderings. The room erupted in chaos, voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. Lady Margaret's cane struck the floor with a sharp crack. Silence! She commanded, a voice trembling with rage. This family will not descend into a circus! But the dam had broken. Beatrice, a face pale, stood abruptly, a voice cutting through the din. Enough of this! I can't stand it any longer! Her hands shook as she pulled the filigree key from her pocket and held it aloft. I found this in the rose garden the morning Thomas died. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was important, and now I think it's connected to everything, welling in her eyes. Because I saw something else that morning. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw Clara near the conservatory, just before Evelyn screamed. She was holding something small, like a cloth. She tucked it away quickly when she saw me watching. Clara gasped, her face draining of color. That's a lie! I was with Lady Margaret all morning! Lady Margaret turned to her companion, her eyes narrowing. Clara, is this true? Clara's hands twisted together, her voice barely a whisper. I went to the conservatory to fetch a shawl for you, ma'am. It was chilly in the drawing room. I didn't see Thomas, I swear. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her voice calm but probing. A shawl, Miss Weston. Yet you told me you never left Lady Margaret's side. And what of this cloth Miss Beatrice saw? Might it have been used to wipe something clean, perhaps a vase or a cigarette stub? Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment it seemed she might faint. I wouldn't. Her words faltered, and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. Inspector Grayson stepped forward, his voice firm. Miss Weston, if you know something, you'd best speak now. Hiding the truth only makes you look guilty. Clara's shoulders shook, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I found a cloth in the conservatory near the body. It had blood on it. I didn't know what to do, so I hid it in my room. I was afraid I'd be blamed. The room froze, the weight of her confession settling like dust. Grayson's eyes widened. Where is this cloth now? In my wardrobe, Clara whispered. Behind the linens. Grayson dispatched the constable to retrieve it, and Miss Marple watched the family closely. Charles's face was ashen, his cigarette forgotten. Evelyn's lips trembled, her hands clutching her shawl. Beatrice's tears had stopped, but her eyes were haunted. Dr. Vance's spectacles slipped down his nose, his composure unraveling. Lady Margaret, for the first time, looked truly shaken, her cane trembling in her grip. The constable returned with a small, blood-stained cloth, its edges frayed. Grayson examined it, his expression grim. This could be the murder weapon's wiping cloth. No fingerprints on the vase, you said. Someone was careful. Miss Weston, you've some splaining to do. Clara sobbed,
her words tumbling out.
"I didn't kill him, I swear it! I only found the cloth after Thomas was dead. I panicked. I thought no one would believe me."
Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Miss Weston, you have done right to tell us now.
This cloth is a vital clue, but it is not the whole story. The truth lies in the connections between the cloth, the key, the ledger, and the note. We are close, but not yet there."
As the family dispersed, their faces etched with fear and suspicion, Hastings whispered to Miss Marple, "Clara's confession changes everything, doesn't it? She's either guilty or covering for someone." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Or neither, Hastings. Fear can make the innocent act guilty and the guilty act innocent. We must look deeper into the heart of this household, where the truth is hidden in plain sight." Outside, the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the roses. And in the library, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads of confession and deception into a tapestry that was nearly complete. Chapter 9. The Trap. The evening shadows stretched long across Enderby Hall, cloaking its corridors in a sombre hush that seemed to mirror the household's growing dread. Clara Weston's confession about the blood-stained cloth had shattered the fragile veneer of civility, and now suspicion hung over the manor like a storm cloud. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room with her knitting, exuded a calm that belied the storm brewing in her mind. Captain Hastings paced nearby, his unease palpable, while Inspector Grayson stood by the fireplace, his notebook now a tangled web of clues and contradictions. "Miss Marple," Grayson said, his voice low, "this cloth is damning for Miss Weston. But I'm not convinced she's our killer. She's too timid, too shaken. And that note, V for Vance, still points to the doctor. We need to shake this household up, get them to talk." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes gleaming with quiet purpose. "Indeed, Inspector. The time has come to apply a little pressure, to see who bends and who breaks. People, you see, reveal themselves most when they believe the noose is tightening." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "I propose we gather everyone tonight, here, in this very room, and lay out what we know. A trap, if you will, to coax the truth from its hiding place." Grayson nodded, a spark of admiration in his eyes. "A confrontation, then. I'll summon the household. What exactly do you plan to say?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Enough to unsettle them, Inspector. The truth is like a stubborn weed. It requires only a small crack to break through." By 8 o'clock, the drawing room was filled with the Enderby household, their faces a mosaic of apprehension and defiance. Lady Margaret sat at the head of the room, her cane a sceptre of authority, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, a silent accusation. Clara, pale and drawn, hovered near Lady Margaret, her hands clasped tightly. Dr. Vance stood by the door, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight, his calm demeanor strained. Miss Marple rose, her slight figure commanding the room's attention. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and measured. "We are gathered to discuss the tragic death of Thomas Reed, a man who served this household faithfully and whose life was ended by a deliberate act. We have uncovered much, clues that point to secrets within these walls. Let us review them." She held up the blood-stained cloth, its frayed edges stark against the lamplight. "This was found by Miss Weston, hidden in her wardrobe. She claims she discovered it in the conservatory, near Mr. Reed's body. A sign, perhaps, of a murderer's attempt to erase their traces." Clara's breath hitched, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor.
Miss Marple continued, producing the cigarette stub. This was found in the study, marked with a red waxy substance matching a shard of the vase that killed Mr. Reed. Someone was careless, someone who smokes perhaps, and was in a room where they should not have been. Charles shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Evelyn, who glared back. Next, Miss Marple gestured to the filigree key. Miss Beatrice found this in the rose garden, a key that unlocks a drawer in the study containing a ledger of payments, large sums, marked with initials, C-E-E-E-H-V, a record of debts, or perhaps something more sinister. Dr. Vance's jaw tightened, and Evelyn's glass clinked against her teeth. Finally, Miss Marple held up the note. And this, found in Mr. Reed's room. The debt must be paid by Friday, or the truth comes out. V. A threat, suggesting Mr. Reed knew a secret worth killing for. But whose secret? And who is V? The room was deathly silent, the air thick with tension. Lady Margaret's cane tapped once, sharply, as if to assert control. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice icy. "You imply we are all conspirators in some sordid plot." "Not all, Lady Margaret," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But one of you, I am certain, knows more than they have told. Let me be clear. Thomas Reed was struck down in the conservatory, not by accident, but by intent. The vase was heavy, requiring force. The scuff mark on the tiles suggests a tool or cane, not a shoe. The cigarette stub and the cloth point to someone who was there, unseen. And the ledger and note suggest a motive tied to money or truth." She paused, her eyes
In my room, as I said.
Charles's voice was low, bitter. "And I was on the terrace. I've told you that." Beatrice's eyes flickered to Clara, then away. "I saw Clara near the conservatory. I've said that already." Clara's voice was a whisper. "I only found the cloth. I didn't do it." Dr. Vance stepped forward, his face pale. "Miss Marple, I am no blackmailer. That note is not mine. I was not here last night." Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "One of you is not telling the truth. The clues do not lie. The cloth, the key, the ledger, the note, the cigarette. They form a pattern, and that pattern points to someone in this room. I ask again, who was in the conservatory and why?" The room seemed to hold its breath, each face a mask of fear or defiance. Then, from the corner, a soft sob broke the silence. Clara Weston, trembling, raised her eyes. I can't keep it any longer," she whispered. "I saw something. Someone. In the conservatory. It wasn't me, but I know who it was." All eyes turned to her, the weight of her words like a spark in dry grass. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her gaze fixed on Clara. "Go on, Miss Weston," she said softly. "The truth. Now." Outside, the night pressed against the windows, the roses invisible in the dark. And in the drawing room, the trap had been sprung, the truth teetering on the edge of revelation. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The drawing room at Enderby Hall was a crucible of tension, the lamplight casting stark shadows across the faces of the assembled household. Clara Weston's trembling confession hung in the air,
Her words, "I saw someone in the conservatory like a spark threatening to ignite the powder keg of secrets." Miss Jane Marple stood at the center of the room, her slight figure radiating quiet authority, her knitting needles still, her eyes bright with the clarity of revelation. Captain Hastings leaned forward, his breath held, while Inspector Grayson gripped his notebook, poised to capture the truth. "Miss Weston," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but unyielding, "you have carried a heavy burden. Tell us what you saw, and let us end this charade." Clara's hands twisted together, her voice barely audible. "It was Dr. Vance. I saw him in the conservatory just before 10. He was standing over Thomas, holding the vase. I didn't know what to..."
Room of suspects. Thomas Reed was struck down in the conservatory between 9 and 10, killed by a single blow from a heavy porcelain vase. The scuff mark on the tiles, not from a shoe, but from a cane or tool, suggested precision. The blood-stained cloth, hidden by Miss Weston, was used to wipe the vase clean of fingerprints. The cigarette stub, marked with red wax, was found in the study, where tobacco lingered in the air. The filigree key, discovered by Miss Beatrice, unlocked a drawer containing a ledger of payments, marked with initials CE, EE, HV. And the note, found in Reed's room, "The debt must be paid by Friday or the truth comes out," V, pointed to a motive of blackmail. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. At first, suspicion fell on many. Charles Enderby, seen near the conservatory with his debts and red scarf. Evelyn Enderby, whose missing necklace and midnight wanderings raised questions. Beatrice, with her key and quiet observance. Clara, with her hidden cloth. And Dr. Vance, whose initials marked the note. But the truth lies not in the obvious, but in the subtle contradictions. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Vance, her gaze piercing. "Dr. Vance, you claim you were in the library, yet Clara saw you in the conservatory. Your housekeeper confirms you were home last night, yet Reed's note suggests a midnight meeting with E and V. The ledger lists payments to HV, sums far beyond a physician's means. And the cigarette stub, marked with red wax, matches the polish you use on your medical bag, a detail you overlooked when you smoked in the study." Vance's hands trembled, his voice rising. "This is absurd. I've no reason to kill Reed. He was nothing to me." "Nothing?" Miss Marple said softly. "Yet he knew something. The ledger reveals payments to you, Dr. Vance, from Charles and Evelyn Enderby. Payments to cover your failed investments, perhaps? Or to keep a secret? Reed, ever observant, discovered this. He wrote the note, signing it V to mimic your initial, intending to confront you. But you learned of his knowledge, didn't you? You met him in the study at midnight, as his note recorded, and when he threatened to expose you, you followed him to the conservatory the next morning." Evelyn gasped, a sherry glass trembling. "Harold, is this true?" Vance's face twisted, his composure shattering. "No, I didn't mean to. It was an accident." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "An accident, Dr. Vance?" "The vase was struck." Hands. "He was going to ruin me," he whispered. "He knew about the money, about my debts. He demanded more, said he'd tell Lady Margaret. I only meant to scare him, but he lunged at me, and I
I hit him." The room was silent, the weight of his confession settling like dust. Lady Margaret's cane fell to the floor, her face ashen. Charles swore under his breath, while Evelyn's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the rug. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, and Clara sobbed quietly. Inspector Grayson stepped forward, his voice firm. "Dr. Harold Vance, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Reed." As the constable led Vance away, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her expression serene. "The truth, you see, is like a garden. It requires care to bring it to light. Mr. Reed was a victim of greed and fear, but the clues, though small, were clear." Hastings, still stunned, shook his head. "Miss Marple, how did you know it was Vance? The note, the cloth, the key. It could have been anyone." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The little things, Hastings. The red wax on the cigarette, the scuff mark, the ledger's initials, they all pointed to a man desperate to hide his shame. And Clara's confession, though born of fear, was the final thread." As the household dispersed, their faces etched with shock and relief, Miss Marple stepped towards the door, her work done. The roses outside swayed in the night breeze, their beauty untouched by the darkness within Enderby Hall. And in the quiet, the truth had finally bloomed. The reflection. The morning after Dr. Vance's arrest dawned soft and clear over Enderby Hall, the sunlight filtering through the roses and casting dappled patterns on the Manor's ancient walls. The household, though shaken, had begun to settle into an uneasy quiet, as if the revelation of the murderer had lanced a wound but left scars behind. The police had departed with their prisoner, and the servants moved about their tasks with subdued efficiency, their whispers now tinged with relief rather than fear. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting bag at her side, her needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she gazed out at the garden. Captain Hastings, ever her faithful companion, stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back, his face still etched with wonder at the previous night's denouement. "Miss Marple," Hastings said, breaking the silence, "I must say, you've done it again. The way you pieced it all together, the cigarette stub, the cloth, the key."
Greeds, their shames, but they leave traces. Dr. Vance's traces were in the details. The red wax on the cigarette, matching the polish of his medical bag. The scuff mark from that same bag, not a cane. The ledger's payments, which spoke of his desperation. And poor Mr. Reed, with his note and his knowledge, became a threat he could not ignore. She paused, her needles clicking softly. "It is the human heart, Hastings, that betrays the guilty." Dr. Vance's calm was a mask, but his hands trembled, his spectacles slipped, and Clara's confession, born of fear, was the crack through which the truth emerged. Hastings shook his head, a wry smile forming. "You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple, but I confess, I was ready to pin it on Charles, with his debts and that red scarf business, or even Evelyn with her missing necklace and sharp tongue." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the roses outside. "They were all suspects, Hastings, and not without reason. Charles's debts made him reckless, Evelyn's secrets made her defensive, Beatrice's key hinted at hidden knowledge, and Clara's silence suggested guilt. Even Lady Margaret,
with her iron control, might have been protecting someone. But the clues, the little things, pointed only one way. The murderer is always the one who cannot account for the details. The door opened, and Lady Margaret entered, her cane tapping with less force than before, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady, despite the strain in her eyes. "I owe you my thanks. This tragedy has shaken us, but your clarity has restored some measure of order. I confess, I never suspected Dr. Vance. He was a trusted friend." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression gentle. "Trust, Lady Margaret, is a fragile thing. Dr. Vance was driven by fear of ruin, of exposure. He betrayed your trust, and poor Mr. Reed paid the price. But you must not blame yourself. The heart of a murderer is a mystery even to those closest to them." Lady Margaret's lips tightened, and she nodded, turning to the window. "The garden party will be cancelled, of course. But Enderby Hall will endure. It always has." As she left, Hastings turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "What now, Miss Marple? The case is solved, the murderer caught. Do we simply leave?" Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her movements deliberate. "Yes, Hastings, our work here is done. The truth has been uncovered, and justice will follow. But I shall take with me the lesson of this house."
Was afraid to speak about the key, but you saw what I could not. Miss Marple smiled, patting her hand. "You did well, my dear. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to act despite it. Keep tending your roses. They will bring you peace." With that, Miss Marple and Hastings made their way to the Manor's entrance, where a car waited to take them to the station. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals untouched by the darkness that had briefly shadowed Enderby Hall. And as the car pulled away, Miss Marple's little grey cells rested, content in the knowledge that order had been restored, at least for now. The train to St. Mary Mead chugged steadily through the rolling countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil left behind at Enderby Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, the knitting needles moving with their familiar precision, her eyes fixed on the passing fields, but her mind still lingering on the Manor's secrets. Captain Hastings, seated opposite, fidgeted with his newspaper, unable to settle. The resolution of Thomas Reed's murder had brought closure, yet something in the air, an unresolved note, kept him restless. "Miss Marple," Hastings ventured, folding the newspaper, "I can't help but feel we've left something unfinished. Vance confessed, the clues aligned, but, well, it all feels too neat, doesn't it? Like a puzzle with one piece still missing." Miss Marple's needle paused, her gaze meeting his with a faint smile. "You are perceptive, Hastings. The truth we uncovered was clear. But the truth, like a garden, has layers. Dr. Vance struck the fatal blow, yes, but I wonder, was he alone in his motives, or was there another hand guiding the shadows?" Hastings frowned, leaning forward. "Another hand? You mean an accomplice? But who? Everyone had their secrets, but none seemed to connect directly to Vance's crime." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her voice soft but deliberate. "Not an accomplice, perhaps, but an influence. The payments with initials Dow. Why? Why did she protect what she knew for so long? The answers to these questions lie in the human heart, where motives intertwine like roots beneath the soil." Hastings' eyes widened. "You think someone else knew what Vance was planning, or pushed him to it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "People, what's desperate, can be fanned by others, by a word, a threat, a promise. Let us consider Clara Weston. Her confession was genuine, but her silence was not. She saw Vance in the conservatory, yet she hid the cloth and said nothing until pressed. Why?
Hastings rubbed his chin. Fear, you said.
She was afraid of being blamed. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly. Or perhaps she was protecting someone or something else. Her loyalty to Lady Margaret is profound, yet there is a shadow in her demeanour, a hint of something deeper. And then there is Evelyn, whose necklace vanished and whose payments to Vance suggest a closer connection than she admitted. The train whistle sounded, jolting Hastings from his thoughts. Evelyn? You think she was involved? But she seemed genuinely shocked by Vance's confession. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Shock can be performed, Hastings. Evelyn is an actress by trade, after all. And the missing necklace, mentioned so casually, yet never found, suggests a motive tied to money. Suppose she was not a victim of theft, but a participant in a scheme. Suppose she and Vance were colluding, and Reed's discovery threatened them both. Hastings leaned back, stunned. But Vance confessed alone. He didn't mention Evelyn at all. Precisely, Miss Marple said. A man of his pride might take the fall to protect another, or to avoid a greater scandal. But let us not speculate too far. There is one detail that troubles me. The note signed V. Vance denied writing it, and I'm inclined to believe him. His handwriting, as seen in Lady Margaret's medical charts, is broad and looping. The note's script was tight, precise, almost feminine. Hastings' jaw dropped. You mean someone else wrote it, posing as Vance, to frame him? Not to frame him, Miss Marple corrected, but to pressure him. The note was meant for Reed, demanding payment by Friday. It was a bluff, perhaps, to scare him into silence. But it failed, and Vance, cornered, acted in panic. The train slowed as it approached a station, the platform bustling with villagers. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, her mind still turning over the puzzle. When we return to St. Mary Mead, Hastings, I shall make inquiries about Clara and Evelyn. Their roles in this affair are not as clear as they seem. Clara's loyalty, Evelyn's secrets. They form a pattern, one I have not yet fully discerned. Hastings shook his head, a wry smile forming. You never stop, do you, Miss Marple? The case is closed, Vance is in custody, and yet you're still digging. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The truth, Hastings, is like a rose.
Jane Marple and Captain Hastings, with its familiar embrace of quiet lanes and blooming gardens, a stark contrast to the shadowed grandeur of Enderby Hall. The train journey had left Hastings restless, his mind still tangled in the threads of the case, while Miss Marple appeared serene, her knitting needles clicking softly as she sat in her cosy parlour, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Yet her eyes, bright and unyielding, betrayed the restless workings of her little grey cells, still probing the unresolved corners of Thomas Reed's murder. Hastings, she said, setting her needles aside, I have been thinking about our time at Enderby Hall. Dr. Vance's confession was the key that unlocked the door, but I cannot shake the feeling that another hand turned the knob. The note signed V, its precise script, so unlike Vance's hand, suggests a deeper deception. We must look closer at those who stood in the shadows. Hastings, stirring his tea, frowned. "You're still suspicious of Clara and Evelyn, aren't you? But Vance admitted to the crime, Miss Marple. What more could there be?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Confessions, Hastings, are not always the end of a story. They can be a curtain hiding another act. Clara's fear, Evelyn's secrets, these are not mere footnotes. They are part of the pattern. I propose we make discreet inquiries here in St. Mary Mead. The village has a way of knowing things, even about those who dwell in grand manors." Hastings nodded, accustomed to her methods. "Very well. Where do we start? The vicarage? Mrs. Price's tea shop? They're always abuzz with gossip." "Mrs. Price's, I think," Miss Marple said, rising. "Her customers see more than they realize, and their tongues are looser than they know." The tea shop was a hub of village life, its tables crowded with locals sipping tea and exchanging tidbits of news. Mrs. Price, a stout woman with a keen eye for detail, greeted Miss Marple warmly. "Miss Marple! Captain Hastings! Back from your adventure at Enderby Hall, I hear. Dreadful business, that butler's murder. They say Dr. Vance did it. Shocking for a physician." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she settled at a corner table. "Indeed, Mrs. Price. But villages, like manors, hold many secrets. Have you heard anything about the Enderby household? Clara Weston, perhaps, or Mrs. Evelyn Enderby?" Mrs. Price leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well now, Clara's been a fixture at Enderby Hall for years, always in Lady Margaret's shadow. But my niece, who works as maid there, says Clara's not as meek as..."
Raised an eyebrow. "A man in London? Could it be tied to the payments in the ledger?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was racing. "Possibly, Hastings. And Clara's letters, most intriguing. Mrs. Price, do you know where these letters were sent?" Mrs. Price shrugged. "My niece didn't see the addresses, but she said they were posted late at night, when Clara thought no one was watching. Always to the same place, though. She recognized the envelope." Miss Marple thanked her and sipped her tea, her thoughts turning inward. Clara's letters, Evelyn's meetings. These are the roots we must unearth. Hastings, I believe we must return to Enderby Hall. There is one more thread to pull, and it lies with Clara. The journey back to Enderby Hall was swift, the manor's ivy-clad walls looming under a grey sky. Lady Margaret received them in the drawing-room, her face weary but composed. "Miss Marple, Captain Hastings," she said, her cane tapping softly. "I thought your work here was done. Dr. Vance is in custody. What brings you back?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "A small matter, Lady Margaret. I wish to speak with Miss Weston. There are inconsistencies that require clarification." Clara was summoned, her face pale, her hands twisting nervously. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've told you everything. I saw Dr. Vance in the conservatory. I hid the cloth out of fear. What more do you want?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone was unwavering. "The truth, Miss Weston. You have been sending letters secretly, late at night. To whom, and why?" Clara's breath caught, her eyes darting to Lady Margaret, who frowned but said nothing. They were personal," Clara stammered. "To a cousin in London. Nothing to do with this." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, gleamed in the lamplight. "A cousin, perhaps, but I suspect these letters were meant for someone else.
Someone connected to the payments in the ledger, perhaps even to the note signed V. You wrote it, didn't you, Miss Weston, to pressure Thomas Reed into silence, not knowing it would push Dr. Vance to murder. The room froze, Clara's face crumpling. I didn't mean for it to happen, she cried, her voice breaking. I knew about the payments. Evelyn and Charles were giving money to Dr. Vance to cover his debts. Thomas found out, and he was going to tell Lady Margaret. I wrote the note to scare him, to make him think Vance was the threat. I thought it would keep him quiet, but it didn't. Lady Margaret's cane clattered to the floor.
Your actions set a tragedy in motion. The note drove Dr. Vance to panic, and Thomas Reed paid the price. Hastings, stunned, whispered, So Clara wasn't the murderer, but she lit the fuse? Miss Marple nodded. Precisely, Hastings. The roots of this crime run deep, tangled in loyalty and fear. Dr. Vance struck the blow, but Clara's note was the spark. As Lady Margaret called for the police to take Clara's statement, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her work nearly complete. The roses outside swayed in the evening breeze, their beauty a silent witness to the truths unearthed within Enderby Hall. Chapter 14. The Final Threads. The twilight cast a gentle veil over Enderby Hall, softening the sharp edges of its ivy-clad walls and bathing the rose garden in a muted glow. Inside, the drawing room was hushed, the weight of Clara Weston's confession lingering like a faint echo. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her knitting needle still, her eyes fixed on the flickering fire as she pieced together the final threads of the mystery. Captain Hastings stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind still reeling from the revelation that Clara's note had set Dr. Vance's fatal act in motion. Inspector Grayson, his notebook now nearly full, paced slowly, his face a mixture of relief and unease. Miss Marple, Grayson said, pausing his steps, you've done it again. Dr. Vance is in custody, and Miss Weston's admitted to writing the note. It's a tidy resolution, but I can't help feeling there's more. The ledger, those payments, Charles and Evelyn's roles aren't fully clear. Are we certain the case is closed? Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her gaze steady. The case is closed, Inspector, in that the murderer has been found, and the spark of his motive uncovered. But you are right to sense a lingering shadow. The ledger's payments, Evelyn's missing necklace, Charles's debts. These are threads that, while not directly tied to the murder, weave a broader tapestry of deceit. Let us tie them off, lest they fray further. Hastings turned from the window, his brow furrowed. You mean to question Charles and Evelyn again? But they've already been cleared of the murder itself. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Cleared of murder, perhaps, but not of secrets. The human heart, Hastings, is rarely content with one sin. Let us summon them and see what light they can shed. Grayson sent for Charles and Evelyn, who entered the drawing room with palpable reluctance. Charles's green scarf was absent, his face pale and drawn, while Evelyn clutched her shawl, her coral lipstick stark against her strained expression. Lady Margaret, seated in her usual chair, watched with a mixture of resignation and dread, her cane resting against her side. Beatrice lingered near the door, her eyes still haunted by the events, while Clara, having shifted the household's dynamic irrevocably, Miss Marple addressed the couple with her characteristic calm. Mr. and Mrs. Enderby, the murder of Thomas Reed has been solved, but questions remained about the ledger found in the study. Payments marked with your initials, large sums, paid to Dr. Vance. Might you explain their purpose? Charles's jaw tightened, his hands fidgeting with his cigarette case. It's no secret I've had debts, he said gruffly. Vance was in a bad way financially. Bad investments, as you know. I lent him money to keep him afloat. Family friend, you understand. Evelyn's laugh was sharp, almost brittle.
Lent? Charles, you gave him money to keep him quiet. He knew about your gambling, your trips to London. He threatened to tell Lady Margaret if you didn't help him. Lady Margaret's cane tapped sharply. Charles, is this true? You compromised the family's name for your reckless habits? Charles's face flushed, but he didn't deny it. It wasn't like that, Mother. Vance was desperate. I thought I was helping him. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but probing. And you, Mrs. Enderby? The ledger lists payments from you as well. Were you also helping a friend? Or was there another reason? Evelyn's eyes darted to Charles, then away. I had my own reasons. My necklace, yes, it went missing, but not because it was stolen. I sold it to raise funds. Vance needed money, and I owed him. Owed him? Miss Marple pressed, her tone deceptively mild. For what, precisely? Evelyn hesitated, her fingers twisting her shawl. He treated me, privately, for nerves. I didn't want it known. He agreed to keep it quiet, but it came at a price. I paid him to ensure his silence. Hastings's eyes widened. Good heavens, Evelyn. You were being blackmailed by Vance? Not blackmail, Evelyn said quickly, her voice trembling. A mutual arrangement. But Thomas must have found out. He was always watching, always listening. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. Indeed, Thomas Reed was observant, and his knowledge made him dangerous. His note, written by Clara to mimic Dr. Vance's initial, was meant to scare him into silence, but it drove Vance to murder instead. Your payments, Mr. and Mrs. Enderby, were the fuel for that desperation, though you did not wield the weapon. Lady Margaret's voice was cold, her eyes fixed on her son and daughter-in-law. You have brought shame upon this house, both of you. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand. Shame, Lady Margaret, is a heavy burden, but it is not my place to judge. The murder is solved, the motives laid bare. The ledger's secrets, though not criminal, have been aired, and the household
Noted, though her actions, while reckless, don't amount to a crime. The rest, well, it's for the family to sort out. As the household dispersed, Charles and Evelyn avoiding each other's gaze, Beatrice approached Miss Marple, her voice soft. You've saved us, in a way. The truth hurts, but it's better than living with lies. Miss Marple patted her hand. Truth, my dear, is like sunlight. It reveals what was hidden, but it also allows growth. Tend your roses, and let time do the rest. Outside, the twilight deepened, the roses glowing faintly under the first stars. Miss Marple and Hastings stepped into the waiting car, the Manor fading behind them. The final threads of the mystery had been woven into place, and Enderby Hall, though scarred, stood ready to face a new dawn. Chapter 15. The Garden Restored. The soft glow of morning light bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle haze, the village's cottages and gardens exuding a timeless calm that seemed to erase the shadows of Enderby Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest parlor, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, a pot of tea steaming on the table beside her. Captain Hastings, visiting for a final debrief before returning to London, sipped his tea, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and lingering curiosity. The case of Thomas Reed's murder had been solved, the guilty parties exposed, and yet the echoes of the Manor's secrets still lingered in his mind. Miss Marple, Hastings said, setting his cup down, I must say, this case was one for the books. Dr. Vance's confession, Clara's note, Charles and Evelyn's payments. It all came together like one of your tapestries, but I can't help wondering, will Enderby Hall ever recover from this? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her needles pausing as she considered his question. Recovery, Hastings, is like tending a garden. The weeds of deceit have been uprooted, but the soil must be nurtured to bloom again. Enderby Hall has weathered storms before, and with Beatrice's steady hand, I believe it will endure. Hastings leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Beatrice. Yes, she seemed the only one untouched by the scandal. Do you think she'll take charge of the estate? Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. She has the heart for it, and the clarity to see what others miss. Lady Margaret is strong, but her time is passing. Charles and Evelyn, I fear, are too entangled in their own follies. Beatrice, with her roses and her quiet strength, may yet restore the family's honor. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Miss Marple's maid ushered in a visitor, Beatrice Enderby herself, her face brighter than it had been at the Manor, though her eyes still carried a trace of melancholy. She held a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which she placed on the table. "Miss Marple, Captain Hastings," Beatrice said, her voice steady, "I wanted to thank you in person."
The truth was painful, but it has set us free in a way. I've brought you something, a token from the garden. Miss Marple unwrapped the parcel to reveal a cutting from one of Enderby Hall's prized roses, its stem carefully bound in damp cloth. "How lovely," she said, her eyes softening. "A rose is a fitting gift, my dear. It speaks of beauty and resilience." Beatrice sat, her hands clasped in her lap. "I've spoken with Lady Margaret. She's decided to step back from managing the estate, and Charles, well, he's agreed to seek help for his debts. Evelyn is returning to London, perhaps for good. I'll stay at Enderby Hall to keep things together." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet approval. "You are wise, Miss Beatrice. The Manor needs a steady hand, and your roses will remind you that even the most tangled roots can yield beauty." Hastings, ever curious, ventured a question. What of Clara Weston? Her part in this, writing that note, was it truly just misguided loyalty? Beatrice's face clouded. "Clara's been sent to stay with relatives in Devon. Lady Margaret couldn't bear to keep her on, but she didn't press charges. Clara meant to protect the family, but her actions, they caused so much harm." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Loyalty, when misdirected, can be as dangerous as betrayal. Clara's note was a spark, but Dr. Vance's desperation was the fire. The truth has a way of balancing such things, in time." Beatrice rose, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "You saw what we could not, Miss Marple. You looked at us, our secrets, and found the truth without judgment. I'll not forget that." As Beatrice left, Miss Marple turned to the rose cutting, her fingers brushing its delicate petals. "A fitting end, Hastings," she said softly. "The garden of Enderby Hall has been weeded, and new growth may begin. But we must always be vigilant, for secrets like weeds have a way of returning." Hastings chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound so poetic, Miss Marple. But I suppose that's why you're the best at this, seeing the poetry in the chaos." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a smile serene. "Not poetry, Hastings, just the patterns of the human heart. They are the same in St. Mary Mead as in Enderby Hall, and they always tell their story if one listens closely." Outside, the village stirred with its usual rhythm, the roses in Miss Marple's garden swaying gently in the breeze. The mystery of Thomas Reed's murder had been laid to rest, its secrets untangled, its truths revealed. And as Miss Marple sipped her tea, her little grey cells rested,